I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, I listened very carefully to my colleagues. No, please listen to me now. Please have patience. We haven't discussed Ukraine for a while, and therefore we're doubly grateful to the Polish presidency for their initiative. We are grateful to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo and Ursula Muller and Mr. Apakan. Thank them for their briefings. Immediately after our statement, you will hear the following. In February 2014, the Ukraine witnessed a revolution of dignity. Well, let me recall that the synonym for the word revolution is the word overthrow, which means that in Kiev they do accept that what happened in Kiev was an overthrow and overtaking of the power. Russia did not acquiesce to that and started war against Ukraine. And these Russia's troops are in Donbass. It's occupying Crimea. Russia, in fact, is conducting the World War III using hybrid means. And this is a combat of civilizations. The world of serfdom threw a gauntlet down to the world of peace. Ukraine is in the forefront of this fight, fighting the Moscow barbary on behalf of the civilized world. And I can continue with the list of the pathetic expressions, but I will leave the opportunity for Mr. Klimkin to develop on these and add to them. The problem is that what we're dealing with here are people who are selling hot air. But we need to give credit to them. The propaganda in Kiev was successful in creating the image of a poor, freedom-loving and peace-loving Ukraine, who is desperately trying to withstand the Mordor which they hate with every fiber of their soul. But they were not alone in this success. They were helped in this success and being helped by its supporters in the West. All of them are here on my left and right-hand side. However, recently even they started understanding that something clashes in this picture. This is far too surreal. Ukraine stated that they are in a state of war with Russia. It is not clear who in this case is the aggressor because we are not in a state of war with anyone. But the state of war has not been declared. The embassies are functioning. There is a visa-free regime on functioning, and millions of people are crossing borders, visiting their families, are coming to Russia in order to make money and spend their vacations in the so-called occupied Crimea. They're involved in business, trade, and are witnessing no hostility, neither from the hostility from the aggressor people or the victim people. This so-called revolution of dignity, but the overthrow, was carried out in order to get rid of the hated Yanukovych regime. So, and where are we now as a result of that? Are the Ukrainians better off today? The incredibly high level of corruption in Ukraine is something that's well known to the Western supporters of Kiev, and they also know about the dire economic situation. But there's a panacea to it all. All of the woes of Ukraine is something that can be written off to Russia, and that is exactly what is happening in caricature form as a rule. Let me give you one example. Prior to the League of Champions in Kiev, a group of Kiev fanatics beat up on the British fans. Unfortunately, this is something that does happen. What followed that was an extraordinarily simple explanation stating there was a provocation on the part of the FSB and the fans were Russians, nationals. Regardless of what is happening in Ukraine, the Russian trace is the universal thing that's being used. My dear friends, you are in deep self-imposed isolation from what is happening in Ukraine. What you are imbuing are the cliches from Western SMEs and Ukrainians one. Did many of you carry out a deep analysis of the socio-economic situation and the moral and psychological climate in the country? Do you know how much dirt and hostility is being poured by the authorities in Kiev into Russia? What falsehoods they resort to, how hateful they are. Not just they, by the way. Do you know what improbable things are being said by some Ukrainian mass media about the situation in the Crimea? About the building of the Crimean Bridge, about the situation in the Donbass? About what the motivations and plans of Russia? You do not know those things, but we do know them very well. The mass media who express their own opinion and the undesirable opinion, even when they're not pro-Russian, even when they're just opposition, those mass media are being closed down. What is the pretext for that? Yes, you're completely correct if you're thinking that this is because they're suspected of acting on behalf of the Kremlin. Independent journalists are being killed. And the investigation into those things are not conducted. Today in Kiev, a Russian national, Arkady Babchenko, a reporter, was killed. Literally a couple of hours ago this happened. And we can suppose that now that the Ukrainians will accuse Russia of it. This has already happened on many an occasion. Other reporters are leaving the country, are leaving the prosecution. If they don't do that, they are being arrested. For example, the Kirill Vyshinsky, who was a Ukrainian national and the head of RIA Novosti in Ukraine. What was the accusation against him? High treason, betraying the state. The level of schizophrenia in Ukraine is off the charts. Let me recall that schizophrenia is not a derogatory term. This is a psychiatric syndrome where is a double personality. Ukraine, thanks to its current authorities, is living into parallel worlds. The state of imagined hybrid war with Russia and the real world where there is no intervention from Russia. And in order to make sure that the reality is not in contradiction with the virtual reality created by Kiev, for that, what is needed is very strict control of the information sphere. Schizophrenia is also something that pervades ideology. The authorities in Kiev are creating a pantheon of new heroes of Ukraine, the independence fighters, and lacking other people whom they put on the pedestal are the leaders of the Ukrainian nationalist organizations. This is the organization which collaborated with the Nazis, and their leaders' names are Bandera and Shuhevich. But it's unimportant that for 50% of the Ukrainians, these people are not heroes, they are criminals, they're collaborationists. The important thing is to make sure that the heroes are anti-Russians. The Polish presidency do know very well who the Bandera and Shuhevich were. The Poles do have their own accounts to settle with these people. They do know about OUN, what organization that was. OUN. During the war, they killed the Jews, the Poles, and the Russians. Well, unfortunately, they didn't say anything about that today. This is for internal Polish consumption. It's not really a done thing to talk about that here. What we're witnessing in Ukraine is the kind of lawlessness that no rule-based government would tolerate. But there, it's okay. And it's also okay to close your eyes to it. The authorities in Kiev are attacking the main liberties and freedoms. They're suppressing dissidents. They are using the means of a police state, and they are promoting the growth in neo-Nazism and are trying to forcibly Ukrainianize the country. In September 2017, a new law came into effect. It's a law on education. Its aim is to fully eradicate the entire Russian language-based education systems. This is at variance with their commitment Ukraine undertook within the framework of the Minsk agreements. They also rescinded the law according to which it was possible to use the Russian language at the regional level. What was ignored was the recommendation of the Venetian Commission about bringing in corrections concerning the rights of national minorities. The measures undertaken by Kiev is a linguistic cleansing. And all the while we know that the Russian language is really not a minority language in Ukraine. All of this is at variance with the Constitution of Ukraine, its its legal commitments of a universal nature. Let me recall that the language issue was one of the main reasons of what happened in Ukraine. But the authorities in Kiev do not want to learn from their mistakes. We're also concerned by the growth in nationalist and chauvinistic feelings in Ukraine. There are torch manifestations in the country to celebrate the birthday of Bandera, and this is done almost on a state level. Nationalists attack mass media offices and the owners of the mass media. On the 9th of May, they tried to arson the Inter channel because the channel was translating a concert devoted to the Victory Day. They continue attacking the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church and Orthodox reporters. On the 9th of May, here at the UN quarters, there was a seminar conducted by the Ukrainian mission to the UN, which they tried to present as an official activity of the Committee on Information. The Ukrainian participants of the so-called ATO, including snipers, tried to physically threaten a Russian diplomat. These snipers and attested as friends. This was done by an official representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Later on, she tried to present it as a Russian slander and lies and propaganda. To date, what hasn't been investigated is the tragedy which took place in Odessa on the 2nd of May 2014, when the radicals burned alive more than 50 people in the House of Trade Unions. But today, this is something that is described as a heroic deed by the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And this is only a small part of what I could quote within the format of this statement. But in actual fact, the situation is even more tragic. And that is why the people in the Crimea decided they didn't want to live under this, and they decided they wanted to move away from this kind of Ukraine. The inhabitants of Donbass were less lucky. A different scenario was played out there. What they are asking for is very little. They were asking for being able to have autonomy within Ukraine, the possibility to speak their own language, to honor their own heroes rather than the ones that were imposed by Kiev. What is absurd about that? Can you tell me? Why is this something that's possible in Belgium, where the Walloons and the Flemish are living peacefully side by side, and not possible in Ukraine? Of course, heaven forfend that something like this should happen in Belgium. I wish them the best and always live in peace. No one is wondering why it is that in Donbass we are not witnessing mass protests against the local authorities, which Kiev authorities characterize as terrorists, even though their lives is very difficult, thanks to the generous concern of the Kiev authorities, who created a trade and economic blockade for their own citizens, whom they seem to be so concerned about. There's nothing that we hear about human rights violations in those territories, nor do we hear about the demands to return to Kiev authority as quickly as possible. Maybe the answer here is simply that these people do want to live in this kind of Ukraine either. You either do not know who you're dealing with, or you know who you're dealing with but decide to close your eyes to it. Because unfortunately, some of you do not want a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. What you do want is a hotbed of instability on the borders of Russia and drawing satisfaction that there is tension in the relations between two brotherly peoples and countries. But you are mistaken thinking that this is something that will last forever. The package of measures for the implementation of Minsk agreements, which was approved in the Security Council Resolution 2202, the fact that this is the only framework for the settlement, and that is something that was mentioned by many, and justly so, on several occasions today. People are very freely bandying the following phrase about Russia has to implement the Minsk agreements. But do many of you in this room know the contents of the Minsk agreements? Have you read them at all? Do you know who, when, how, and in what sequence need to implement? I'll take the liberty of reminding you. The package of measures consists of 13 points. Points 1, 2, and 3. Comprehensive ceasefire and the withdrawal of heavy weaponry. Over the 3 years, Kiev still has not managed to have a comprehensive ceasefire, and also they ignore the ceasefires announced by the contact group. Their equipment is absent from their armories and used to shell peaceful objects in Donbass. To address what was said by the representative of the UK, the workers of the filtration station and the filtration station itself was shelled by the Ukrainian side, not by the militias. According to the data of the Special Monitoring Session, since the beginning of this year, 5 people died and 33 civilians were wounded in the territories under militias' control, whereas on those territories controlled by the government, 1 peaceful citizen was wounded. Kiev undermined and continued undermining the implementation of the agreement on the separation of forces and means as of the 20th September 2016, even though the militia people constantly repeat that they are ready to abide by it. The Ukrainian forces regularly take over the inhabitants in the so-called gray area where this is forbidden. They also block demining. Military preparations are fully underway. The Ukrainian side today is carrying out a military exercise of the so-called United Military Forces. Today, over the Donbass, the Ukraine, for some reason, carried out exercises using aviation. And a number of countries, instead of insisting on Kiev implementing their commitments, started providing Ukraine with weapons. What kind of contribution to the Minsk agreements is this? Item 4, the dialogue on the modalities of conducting local elections. Kiev is not even planning to have any kind of dialogue, ignoring the fact that the Minsk agreements were signed by representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk. You listen to the Ukrainian politicians, well, you will get the impression that people are not there at all. It's only inhabited by terrorists. In the meantime, we know that 4 million Ukrainians live in Donbass. Items 5 and 6, pardon, amnesty, release, and the exchange of hostages. In violation of the agreement, Kiev is refusing to pass laws on the pardoning of the militias, despite the fact that the analogous procedure as regards those who participated in Maidan in 2013 was carried out, and the militias on many an occasion stated that they are ready to exchange an all-against-all exchange. Kiev continues objecting to that. Item 7, safe access, humanitarian access. The problems here, they were mentioned by Ms. Mueller, is something that needs to be resolved within the periodically meeting Minsk contact group. The main problem is the lack of the willingness of Kiev to have a dialogue with the representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk. As a result, the inhabitants of this region can only count on supplies coming from Russia. And that's exactly what we're also being criticized for. Item 9, restoring economic and social links. So there's a full blockade of Donbass by Kiev, economic, transport, and food. That's probably how they are trying to make sure that the ordinary citizens return to their fold. Item 9, restoring full control over the border. That is the item where in Kiev and Washington people start reading the package of measures. But it states very clearly that this is something that needs to take place, I quote, on the first date after the local elections, provided item 11 is conducted. And that is carrying out the constitutional reform. This has not taken place today. It's only after that that item 10 provides for the disarmament and the withdrawal of illegal groups, which according to Kiev are the militias and the mythical Russian troops, and in order to demonstrate that they're using various fakes. I would like to disappoint you yet once again and tell you that there are no Russian troops in the Donbass. By the way, it was very original to hear what was said by the distinguished representative of the United States when she lectured us about violations of international law and invading other countries. This is being said by the representative of the U.S., the country with a long history of illegally invading sovereign states, including during the very recent time. The constitutional reform in item 11 should have been completed by the end of 2015. Its key elements are decentralization and enshrining in law the special status of Donetsk and Lugansk. Amongst the rights there is a right to use their own language, self-governance, and developing of cooperation with the Russian regions. This has not been done, but not only that, this has basically been cancelled by the law on the so-called reintegration of Donbass, which was passed on the 24th February this year. The Minsk agreements are not even mentioned in this law. Item 12, conducting local elections upon agreements with the representative of Luhansk and Donetsk. Since Kiev is rejecting dialogue, this item obviously is not being implemented either. Item 13, creating a working group on specific aspects of the implementation of the Minsk agreements. So who do you think is going to should implement the Minsk agreements? Which ones of the items is under the responsibility of Moscow? The Ukrainian leadership continues shirking their commitments under the Minsk agreements in the political area. They are not providing for a law for the special status for the self-government of Donbass. They are undermining the Steinmeier formula for the special status of Donbass. The reason they're undermining the agreements are undermined by Kiev are very simple. Kiev does not want a settlement, and they do not want Donbass. Why would they want millions of anti-authority people on the eve of presidential elections which are to take place in 2019? The rating of the bankrupt Kiev authorities today is as low as could possibly get. If you really want a settlement, what you need to do is have negotiations with Donbass, which means that you have to accept that this is an internal Ukrainian conflict, that this is a war where brother kills brother. This is the naked truth. But this is suicidal, both internally and in terms of external policy. Kiev does not have the political will for that, and they can't afford the destruction of a very convenient paradigm of the Russian aggression and terror supported by it. It's a very useful shield behind which to hide and obtain support on the West. So we are going to continue the imitation of activity, shows, and high rhetoric on the part of Kiev politicians. Mr. President, in 2015, the Security Council undertook an attempt to extend real international assistance to Ukraine. Resolution 2202 enshrined the package of measures under the Minsk agreements as a framework which to date is being reiterated as the only effective mechanism to have a political resolution to the situation. But no one should be under an illusion that any kind of decision could be viable without taking into account the will of the people in Donbass. And it is in support of these agreements between Kiev, Donetsk, and Lugansk that we spoke about thinking about having a peacekeeping operation by the UN. Unfortunately, instead of that, what we are witnessing in attempts to have under the UN umbrella an alternative settlement format and to replace the efforts by SME, the normative format, and turn the package of measures on the Minsk agreements upside down. Nonetheless, this support that we have heard today, the support to the Minsk agreements, and the only thing that's needed here is to read them correctly and implement them consistently. This gave us hope that we will be able to obtain settlement in this country lacerated by conflict. This is something that first and foremost the simple Ukrainians suffer from, and Russia is more interested in this than anyone. And that is why, Mr. President, we propose that we pass a short statement by the President. Please allow me to read this out. The Security Council reaffirms unconditionally its Resolution 2202, which endorses the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements, adopted and signed in Minsk on 12 February 2015. Calls to ensure full, comprehensive, and sequential implementation of the package of measures, including a comprehensive ceasefire as provided for therein. Urges to refrain from any steps or rhetoric that contradicts the letter and the spirit of the Resolution 2202. And we do hope that the Council will unanimously reaffirm their commitment to the peaceful settlement in Ukraine on the basis of the Minsk agreements. Mr. President, I can, of course, not shirk an issue which is very important and sensitive. Many of those who spoke today talked about the downing over the skies over the eastern Ukraine of the MH17 in July 2014. We greatly mourn that event, and as do all, expect to see an independent and impartial investigation. We weren't planning to discuss this today because it's not directly related to the political settlement in Ukraine. But since the joint investigation team decided to hurry up with yet another portion of their comments, trying probably to make sure that they're in time with the meeting today, and some delegations here, without going through it carefully, did use this anti-Russian sentiment, will say the following. Our view of the tragedy 4 years down the line has not changed. We are, of course, extremely upset by this tragedy and mourn the victims and express our sympathies to their loved ones. We insist on conducting a credible investigation. The true perpetrators for this tragedy should be determined on the basis of reliable proof and brought to account. Let me remind here that Russia, immediately after this tragedy, was at the inception of Resolution 2166, which demanded conducting an international investigation and provided for its very clear criteria. From the moment of the disaster, we have extended to the Dutch side regular and maximal assistance and called upon ensuring that the investigation is transparent. The Office of the General Prosecutor of Russia has always swiftly and fully reacted to requests for legal assistance. We declassified and gave to the investigation the design specifications of the book system. We also provide the outcome of the experiment commanded by the manufacturer, the Almas Ante concern. We did something that no one has done. In October 2016 already, we sent our initial radiolocation data, which are of critical importance for the investigation, because it is impossible to doctor them. They, inter alia, exclude the possibility of firing the missile from the territory which is under the control of the militias. This is something that investigators insist on. Nonetheless, this information was not even included in the investigation. So I put a direct question to you. Why not? And how can we understand the refusal of the Dutch side to assess the key circumstance in this tragedy, the fact that the Ukrainian authorities did not close the air over the area of conflict to aviation? Or why is it that the radio location data from Kiev or information about what was done by the Ukrainian air traffic controllers is not part of the investigation? Let me also recall that the U.S. have not to date provided their satellite pictures, despite the fact that they said that they had them immediately after the disaster. And instead of taking into account irrefutable facts, JIT is manipulating the data from social networks whose reliability cannot be verified. Prior to the end of the investigation, the team started the chain reaction of accusation against Russia in the spirit of the British highly likely. European investigators continue discrediting themselves by putting up accusations before the investigation is complete. All of this shows us that there is a lack of willingness to seriously investigate, and also shows us there is an ideological and political background to the looking for the perpetrators. Instead of that, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands told us today about what was stated by the Netherlands and Australia. It was a demand to Russia to accept our responsibility without any kind of appeal. I am not going to comment upon that, or especially the tone of that letter, because I do not want to offend the minister from the Netherlands. But I wanted simply to recall, just in case you forgot about that, that the language of ultimatums is not something that anyone will be allowed to use when speaking to Russia. We reiterate our readiness to extend any kind of assistance to a truly independent and transparent investigation, but we cannot accept the unfounded conclusions of the JIT. Taking into account what poor methods some states are using today, we can trust only those investigations in which Russia is a fully-fledged participant. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for his statement.